John Barry has done some research on the phrase toxic masculinity and shows how it does more harm than good. It's ideological, not really scientific. It's a phrase that's thoughtlessly used and it does more harm than good. Certainly, as a therapist, I've worked with a number of boys and men where in some cases their previous therapist blamed toxic masculinity for their problems, and that just made them completely disengage. What do you mean? I don't want to hear that. Do I need to hear that?
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast, where the truth will set you free.
Welcome. I'm here today with Phil Mitchell, who is a psychotherapist, author, trainer, supervisor, public speaker, and specializes in working with male abuse victims and highlights bias against men. I'm really looking forward to our conversation, so welcome.
Thank you for inviting me, Ryan.
So let's start off who you are and what your background is.
So I suppose my professional background, if you want to call it that, is that I am a counsellor and psychotherapist by trade. I've been doing that for I think just over 20 years, approaching 21 years now. So I guess that's my professional background. As you said, I supervise training and qualified therapists and other practitioners as well, working within this field and in other fields. I deliver training, webinars. So I guess that is my background. And a big chunk of my time, I guess, was that I ran a service or a project that worked with sexually abused and exploited boys, or boys that were assessed as being at risk of being sexually exploited.
Yeah. And what motivated you to get into this line of work?
Lots of different things. So I guess there's two parts to that, depending on what how I'm thinking about it. So in terms of what got me into counselling, I was bullied very badly in school. I got a counsellor in school, and I remember that being incredibly supportive, and that was one influencing factor that made me decide to pursue counselling. And when I started my counselling training, I noticed that I was working with a number of men, purely by accident or coincidence, if you like, men who were coming to therapy for bereavement, anxiety, work stress, but they all mentioned that they'd all experienced some sort of abuse in their life. And I thought, oh, wow, that's really interesting. They've mentioned this, but it wasn't really the focus of the therapy. And kind of that kind of prompted me to, or that led me to then running a service that worked with boys who were being, or were assessed as being at risk of being sexually abused and exploited. And it was through that work that I very quickly realised that whilst I'm certainly not saying girls and women have got it easy, I saw the issues that were uniquely and in some cases disproportionately affecting boys and men and abused boys and men, and just how they really were being neglected, not taken seriously. And then that got me into seeing that actually boys and men had loads of other issues and adversities that they were facing that hardly anyone was talking about. And so whilst it all started for me working with a lot of boys and men that had experienced sort of sexual abuse as children, adults, or both, that led into me then, I guess, just organically working with boys and men that had experienced all manner of abuse, not just sexual abuse.
Do you see this issue as kind of being ignored or overlooked? Because the general attitude seems to be, well, boys and men have all the privilege, so we probably shouldn't spend too much time working on those issues.
It's just a boring old trope, I have to say. I hear it every week, especially at the minute within the media. So I think the concept of privilege is interesting. What is it? How do you define it? I think, if you are born into a family that has huge wealth, then you could reasonably perhaps say that you are born into privilege. I think there are perhaps average biological sex differences that can influence things that men can do more effectively than women, and women can do more effectively than men. I'm not sure I personally would put that under the heading of privilege, but ultimately what we do is it's the classic, what's, compared to as the apex fallacy. We look at the wealth, the CEOs, the extreme power that exists in society, and we see that, well, a lot of that is held by men. And so we say, well, that's just representative of men. No, it's not at all. You can't kind of take that amount of men who have got huge power and say that that's representative of men in general. It's just not. And I think that there are different types of power. So the power to influence, the power to be believed. I don't think power is necessarily just about wealth and physical strength. I think there's other types of power as well. And I think, if you speak to anyone about the idea of what is male privilege, what is it? What does it look like? You often find in many cases, it's all these ideologies based on assumption, ideology based on more ideology. And if you really take your time to look at specific examples, a lot of them often crumble in the face of logical science and common sense.
Yeah, it seems so illogical to say, Donald Trump and Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos are doing really well. Therefore, we don't need to worry about a teenage boy who's going through bullying and abuse and things like that. When you say it out loud like that, it sounds so illogical.
Yeah, absolutely. And, like I said, I think, I won't get into, I think people like Trump and all of that, everyone's got different views and opinions. But I think, when you take, a small number of extremely powerful men, whether they are perpetrating abuse or they're helping people or, whatever, that is not representative of men in general. It just is not. And to say it is a bit of a fallacy, in my opinion.
Yeah. So what types of abuse issues are you seeing men report?
So in my own practice, historically, if we go back, what year we now, if we go back maybe 10 years ago, it was mainly sexual abuse. But I think that's because at the time, I guess I was known within certain circles to work with boys and men that had been sexually abused. So they are the clients that were often referred to me. They're the boys and men I attracted. But through that work, I found that I was working and am working with boys and men who'd experienced domestic abuse, different types of physical abuse, emotional abuse, financial abuse, neglect, false allegations, boys and men that had experienced sexual abuse but were threatened with false allegations. Certainly, if the perpetrator was a woman, interestingly enough. Other things as well, paternity fraud, which gets nowhere near enough attention, as I think. So men who had brought up or thought that their child was their child, and it turned out later wasn't their child. And so lots of different types of abuse. And also there's types of abuse that men go through and they don't recognize it as abuse. They don't see it as abuse. You ask a man, have you ever been a victim of domestic abuse? He might say no. Well, the problem there is you've got the word victim, and that creates all sorts of connotations and interpretations from different people. Women on average are more likely to identify with language around victimhood than men are. And domestic abuse, well, everyone has a different idea about what that is as well. So if you say to a man, have you ever been a victim of domestic abuse? He might go, no. But then if you say to him more specifically, has your wife or any of your exes ever slapped you across the face when they were angry? And you might get a different answer.
So you gave me 3 issues that I want to unpack, and I want to start with the abuse one, specifically with male victim and female perpetrator, because that's one that you don't hear nearly as much about, and I feel like that's one that's more likely to be dismissed. But first of all, you got the issue of not being believed or not taken seriously, and then you've got the issue like that's what you painted has happened to me before in relationships. And as a man, you're raised with this you never hit a girl mentality, and if we're kind of in an even fight, I wouldn't be as threatened. But knowing that I can't fight back is it's actually puts you at fairly serious risk of harm. So if you're a man in those situations, that's a very unique abuse situation that you're dealing with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is this real oversimplification and a bit of a misconception around the dynamic where men on average, and I emphasize averages here, not absolutes, before anyone starts to cancel me and things like that. We're talking about average sex differences. Yeah, men on average have more physical strength than women on average. They do. That's just, but it doesn't mean that most men who have more physical strength than women use that to harm and abuse women or anyone. If you look at history and you spend a bit of time looking into it, you'll actually see that, men on average use their physical strength to help rather than harm. But we don't talk about that. What we just say is, well, women have got less physical strength than men, so actually they're the ones that are abusive in the relationship, and women can, there are people out there genuinely believe women cannot be abusive in the relationship. Yes, they can. Of course they can. And if you look at various studies, various research, lots of literature out there, what we know is that abusive women who have less physical strength than their male partners will compensate for that. They will wait till he's asleep. They will drug him. They'll wait till he's drunk. They'll take him by surprise. They will use weapons. They will recruit other people to do perpetrate the violence for them. And as you've quite rightly said, they will use men's physical strength against them from the kind of narrative, if you like, of being brought up saying men must never hit a woman. I think, let's just not hit anybody. But I think the point is that it's how some abusive women can use the fact that the man has more physical strength to their advantage. I've worked with numerous men, and there's studies out there, there's qualitative research that has examples that show that when the police turn up to a domestic dispute or an altercation, the woman is crying, upset, appearing scared. Whether she is or isn't is, sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. And then they'll see that actually the man has perhaps punched a hole in the wall. So they'll see that she's scared, and they can be in the cells for the night. But the fact that she slapped him across the face, that will not get brought up. Yeah, she touched him, he didn't touch her. And so, it gets very complicated, and it's not always as straightforward as I've just said there. But I think that this is before we talk about other types of abuse. So physical abuse is not always, in my opinion, the worst type of abuse. For example, it's horrible and it's horrific, and, a bruise, a broken bone, all of that, all of the psychological damage that can go with that, it matters and it needs acknowledging and addressing, of course. But I've worked with plenty of men who have said that the black eye, the bruise, the cut lip, the physical injury that their partner inflicted on them was nothing compared to the threat of going through with the false allegation. And so it comes back to that power again, where actually what we know is if you can influence, the structure, if you can influence the police to such a degree that they can be the ones that will treat your partner as a perpetrator when he's actually a victim, that's an incredible amount of power to have. And if we look at, there's numerous, like Richard Spencer, for example, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the case, but Richard Spencer, in the documentary, he said himself, I can't remember if Cherie Spencer, the perpetrator, his ex, I can't remember if she did threaten him. She certainly threatened false allegations, according to him. Whether she went through with it, I don't know. But so many men, the threat of a false allegation terrifies many men, because they know in many cases that you see a big, strong man versus a woman who is not big and strong, she will say, he did this to me. That can be enough to cancel you. It can, and however it proceeds, we don't know. But that threat is absolutely terrifying.
It's quite a big threat to wield, regardless of where it goes. I'm sure you're familiar with the Duke lacrosse scandal.
Vaguely, I haven't. I only kind of. I know it's musings there.
Yeah.
So I'm not massively.
It was back in 2006 here in the States, but man, that's one to read up on. It's so powerful for so many reasons. And one of the players, because they got completely cleared of all allegations, but one of the players said, when I died, what the newspapers will write is, like accused rapist dies today. Even though everyone knows that I didn't do it, that's going to be part of who I am until the day that I die. And those allegations just stick, regardless of how much legitimacy they have. Another thing that was really scary about that case is how much the media just loved to jump on that bandwagon. I don't know if you can comment more on that false allegation thing, because there's so much there, and so much that, it's just like we love to want to believe it.
I think, it's a really controversial issue, because you get people on both sides of the fence who go to the extreme length, which is just really not helpful. So say, so every woman who makes an allegation is lying. No, not at all. So you think every single woman who makes an allegation, every single one of them's telling the truth? No, let's have some balance. Let's have some logic here. Let's be open to all possibilities. But yes, with the media, there seems to be this narrative of if you are a man and you are accused of something, you are guilty until you are innocent, which is a horrific. It goes against all the sort of moral principles of law. And it's absolutely terrible. And false allegations happen. They get absolutely nowhere near the amount of attention that I think they should be given. And these are, and this is before we even talk about other, sexual harassment at work, domestic abuse, exes accusing people of touching their kids inappropriately. That's before we talk about sexual offences. And so many of them are often not reported to the police. So there's the bulk that we don't know about. And often what you see is this narrative, oh, well, they're rare. And I'm like, well, how do we know that? How do we know they're rare? I have had in the last year or two, I can't remember, maybe 2 years, about 10 or 11 current/ex serving members of the police who have contacted me, and they've all said very different things. And I only have permission to share a quote from one of them because they're a bit nervous about sharing, and I've shared it online. But basically, they've all said to me, some anonymously, that they know false allegations happen. They have examples within their work where they have seen false allegations. They have seen malicious false allegations that have been proven that they happened, but they had a superior officer, member of the police, etc., who basically said to them, well, no, but we can't pursue that. We don't want to pursue that. We shouldn't pursue that because it will deter genuine victims from coming forward. And perhaps it will, but the outcome of that is pretty clear, that men, and it is predominantly men, but men who are falsely accused and the harm they go through, they are the acceptable collateral damage when it comes to tackling violence against women and girls. How are we okay with that? How is that okay? That's absolutely appalling. And there are boys and men whose lives can be absolutely ruined, as you've alluded to, through a false allegation. And the problem that we have as well, certainly here in the UK, in addition to police being told, no, don't pursue it, there is not enough robust data, there's no collection methods, but all of the offences that could, the actual wording of the offences that link to false allegations, they all kind of link to how it's the police that is the victim, wasting police time, the league. What about the men whose lives could be ruined through this? They are the victims, and there is absolutely no stand-alone offence of a malicious false allegation. It's swallowed up in a heading which covers all sorts of other offences that involve lying. And so I would suggest that we should be considering the question, do we need a specific offence relating to proven malicious false allegations? Because that would be quite interesting. And what might we learn from that? But you get all of the people saying, but it's rare, it's rare, it's rare. But how do we know it's rare? Well, look at the data. Well, hang on, data, official data relies on, all of the known instances where the allegations are proven to be false and malicious. It relies on all of them feeding into data. A lot of them don't. Well, because the police have got the pressure to do everything to tackle violence against women and girls, which of course needs tackling, but not with the collateral damage of men being falsely accused. So again, there's so many gaps and so many assumptions being made based on data which is created from sources that are or methods that are quite problematic.
Yeah, I mean, I unpacked a little bit of the data in my book, and there was, I think, FBI DNA data shows that 20% of the DNA does not match, and another 20% is inconclusive. And there's some estimates that could be as high as 50% of rape allegations are false. So, I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty, but the typical feminist claim is only 2% of rape allegations are false, and that's pretty clearly not the case. But there's this pretty powerful asymmetry here, where if a man physically or sexually assaults a woman, that could ruin her life with PTSD basically. But a woman making a false allegation, that could A, land a man in prison for 30 years, or B, completely ruin his reputation for the rest of his life. And the punishments for those two things are completely different.
Absolutely, and there's been cases, you can do a bit of Googling, look at the news articles. There's plenty out there. There was one a few weeks, well, there's been a few recently, but there was one a few, I think it was last week or the week before, where a woman had admitted that when she was younger, she lied about, it might have been the case you mentioned earlier, actually, but she lied about, she said, yes, I lied and I'm sorry. But the thing is, okay, you lied and you were sorry. What's the outcome of that? What justice do you face for that? None. I very much doubt someone saying, yes, I committed a sexual assault on someone and I'm sorry. That would never, oh, yeah, all right, you're sorry, fine. And again, there's almost like, yes, but there's a big difference between a sexual assault and a false allegation. Well, there are differences, but the similarities are that both can cause extreme trauma, severe distress. And I think, arguably, those who say that they've been sexually abused are often believed, I'm not saying in all cases, but often believed they get access to support. Those who say I was falsely accused are more likely to be viewed with suspicion. So there's a real sort of difference there. But, you know, I think there's real problems around, as I've said, how we collect the data. It really isn't robust enough. And if we look at, I think it was something the Home Office produced in 2014, was it? I can't remember exactly. Was it 2014? I might have got the date wrong. I'm not too sure. But ultimately, it was saying that something like, I think they originally said 6% of allegations of rape are false. They later clarified that to say no, maybe we got it wrong. It might be 3%. And so when you look at the percentage, well, that 3% is quite low. So yeah, so there's problems with how the data is ignored and gathered, and sometimes it's kind of not gathered at all. So something from the Home Office, again, I think it was 2014, I can't remember exactly, but it basically said that around 3% of reported rapes, focused on that, 3% of reported rapes were kind of proven to be false. And people, 3%, oh, that's nothing, isn't it? But actually, if we take the 3%, look at Office of National Statistics data and kind of do the maths, it equates roughly to about 40 men a week being falsely accused of rape. That's not nothing to minimize at all. And that's based on the Home Office telling us that the 3% where they are known or suspected to be proven to be malicious and false. So you can only imagine perhaps other cases, what they don't know about. On average, about 40 men a week. So again, we can't. How can we ignore that? How are we okay with that? And again, you know, we can't minimize that. We shouldn't ignore that. And I've worked with, and again, it's not something I set out to do. I certainly didn't intend to work with boys and men who'd been falsely accused. It just kind of happened organically, and it started by working with boys and men who'd been sexually abused, and their perpetrators had sexually abused them and said, I will say that you've abused me if you tell anybody. Then it went in, then I found boys and men coming to me who had experienced domestic abuse and the false allegations were happening. Then through that, I found more boys and men coming to me who said, I've been here because I've been falsely accused. And I know that you're not going to blame me. You're not going to judge me. You'll believe me. And I thought, well, I'm a therapist. It's my job to believe anything someone tells me if they're sitting in front of me, unless I've got clear evidence to the contrary. But yeah, I think the minimization of the effects of false allegations, it needs more attention. And it doesn't mean we should ignore that girls and women are being abused. Of course we shouldn't. Nobody's saying that. And as I'm saying that, people will think, Phil, why are you saying that? You know, you don't need to say that. And I kind of think, no, we don't need to say it. But sometimes people will assume. So we ignore girls and women and what they're going through, and we'll just focus on these. But no, the point is we have quite a lot of people and a lot of resources focusing on girls and women. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But in comparison, we have a lot less funding, a lot less resources, and a lot less media attention going into issues affecting boys and men. And it all comes down to that narrative of the media, government, perhaps even society seems happy to promote this narrative that boys and men, perpetrators, girls and women, victims. And it's far too simplistic.
So we've gotten a couple examples with with a pretty blatant double standard. One is the physical and sexual abuse, domestic violence, for instance. So, male abuser, female victim gets a lot of attention. This is really highlighted. When it's the reverse, female perpetrator and male victim, it's essentially ignored. And then the false allegation thing, if one person's life is ruined, we put a high degree of value on that. If another person's life is ruined, sorry, that's the cost of doing business, basically. The third issue that you brought up that I wanted to talk about is paternity fraud. And that's an issue that either you don't hear much about, or it almost sounds like a technical glitch in the legal system. It sounds like something kind of minor. But when you think about it, a lot of people's greatest source of meaning in life is their children. And if you find out your children are not yours, that could be an incredibly traumatizing crisis for a lot of people. What can you tell me about paternity fraud?
That it is, I would argue that it's even more ignored and less acknowledged than false allegations are. I think again, it's the idea that, oh, well, it rarely happens. And well, again, I think, a lot of this links to the assumption about what we know and what's reported, and whether it's paternity fraud, false allegations, domestic abuse, sexual abuse. I think we need to stop equating what's reported as 100% evidence as what's happening. What's reported, evidence is what's reported, not necessarily what's fully happening. And I think that's important to remember. But it's that bond. So many dads have that loving, close bond with their children, and then your entire outlook is shattered when you find out that this person is not your son or your daughter. And some guys go, well, do I stay? Do I not? What's going on? What's happening here? And the lie and the deceit from some people that contributes to that, it can be very, very, very traumatic. I think, again, there was an article, oh gosh, when was it now? There was an article from 2017, I believe it was, that said of the men that go to DNA clinics to see if their child is actually biologically theirs, nearly half discovered that they're not the biological father. Nearly half. And a lot of people didn't believe that. Some people doubt it. And, I think nearly half, I think is quite high. But again, to come back to your point, the impact is absolutely huge. And whether it is more common than we realise or less common, I don't know. I think it's difficult. I think it's an issue that needs more attention. And I think if you have lied knowingly that and basically said that this person is the biological father, knowing that that is incorrect or that it could be incorrect, perhaps we need more attention to that, and maybe there needs to be more penalties and attention given to that.
Have you worked with many men who've dealt with paternity fraud?
I think it depends how you define that. I've worked with some, definitely. Yeah, yeah. I worked with so last year I worked with about four. Four. Was it 4 or 5? I can't remember, around that figure. That was last year. Again, so it was how you define many. I've certainly also spoken with men who wanted a therapist near where they live, who has got experience in this or has got knowledge on it. But again, I think the issue just gets nowhere near as much attention. And when you bring it up, you get dismissive responses. It's been neglected. The effects of it are minimized. It really needs more attention. But yeah, I've worked with some men that have been through that.
What is the psychological state of these men? Because I can't imagine spending years building a bond with kids and going to work every day trying to provide for my family, and then one day waking up and realizing it was all a lie. How do these men respond to that?
Well, so for example, there are some where it's been proven, and there was a case, it was earlier this week actually, where a guy, he was in the news and it was on Good Morning Britain over here, and I was very surprised it was getting any media attention. You can imagine certain media bodies gave it no attention whatsoever, but he basically found out that his ex-partner had faked a DNA test. And I can't remember exactly how she'd done that, but she had faked a DNA test and said, look, you are the biological father. And it turned out that was fake. And he wasn't. And I think, now I might be wrong saying this, people can Google this, just go to Google, type in, Good Morning Britain, man, fake paternity test, fake DNA test, it will come up. I think she might have gone to prison, I think. But the point is, he himself talks about how utterly devastating that was. Your entire worldview, if you like, or your perception of fatherhood, that bond, it completely causes this huge severe trauma. Some have said, oh, well, if you need a biological bloodline to have that connection, there's something wrong with you. I think that's a bit of gaslighting there. It's a case,
Yeah,
well, you know what, take some responsibility for the lie that you have created, rather than deflect onto, this poor guy struggling to deal with the effects of your lie.
that is so disgusting that people would. There's something wrong with you for not being okay with my infidelity and then deceiving you into thinking these are your kids. Gosh, that's terrible. And the thing is, like, I don't want to in any way say that, like, the type of violence perpetrated by men is okay, but all the type of violence perpetrated by men is illegal, and we punish it very harshly. And as horrific as paternity fraud is, there's no laws against it.
Yeah, I think, like I've said, I'm not sure the example that I've just given that was featured on Good Morning Britain. I can't remember what the legalities around it was that may have led to her being put in prison, fraud or something. I'm not too sure, but yeah, I think the actual offence. To the best of my knowledge, and anyone listening to this, feel free to get in touch and correct me if I'm wrong. But to the best of my knowledge, there is no specific law, certainly here in England, that says paternity fraud is against the law. It might lean more towards being a civil matter, but as we know, certainly here, to pursue civil matters can take a lot of time and a lot of money. And I think that's the thing. It's the case of let's does that need to be a law? Should it come under a type of fraud? It's certainly worth asking the question. But I think the bottom line is, whether it should or shouldn't, or people agree or disagree, the issue is one that gets very, very little attention.
Wow. So here in the US, and I think it's similar in the UK, men are really struggling. Men are dropping out of the labor force, dropping out of education. There's a rise in addiction issues, rise in mental illness, rise in suicides. A lot of men, it seems like, are checking out and giving up in a lot of ways. What are you noticing? What is going on with men?
Think I'd probably say, I wouldn't ask the question what's going on with men. I'd probably say what's going on with the attitude towards men. Certainly at the minute, every day, it's not always every day, but certainly at the moment, every day, toxic masculinity, toxic this, the amount of times that we, as in society, the government, the media, very quickly and easily, often thoughtlessly and hatefully, attach the word toxic to boys, men, and masculinity is appalling. And if we attach that word to any other sort of demographic, as often as we do with boys and men, there would be outrage. There would be headlines all over the place. But because it's boys and men, the implications is, yeah, just put up with it. Yeah, well, actually, boys and men are the ones doing all this horrible stuff. But, well, what horrible stuff? And that's because the horrible stuff that girls and women are doing, you ignore it, you minimize it, or you justify it, or you say that because the minority of abusive women being smaller than the minority of abusive men, oh, well, we don't need to address that in the same way. And it's just, it all comes from hate and neglect. It comes from a society that suggests very strongly we care a lot more about harm facing girls and women. And some might argue we should. I'm not sure, but the point is, we care a lot more about the harm facing girls and women. And the point is, a lot less about the harm facing boys and men. Now, I'm not saying that everything should be perfectly 50-50. I'm not sure how realistic that is. But it's not that it's, well, perfectly 50-50 like that. It's so skewed that the gap between the two is a gaping, massive disparity that makes the Grand Canyon look like a little pothole.
So I've heard a lot in recent years in the media about, like, incels. That it's getting a lot of attention. Recent, I haven't seen the show, but the show Adolescence focuses on that. What can you tell me about what you're seeing in terms of how that's being covered?
it comes up to what I said earlier, the toxic masculinity, that term being churned out. What I would suggest anyone listening to this, read research by John Barry, who is I want to make sure I've got his title right. He's the chair, I believe, of the Centre of Male Psychology. And the Centre of Male Psychology here in the UK has some great research, great publications. It's free to sign up. I'd suggest looking at their newsletter. But John Barry has done some research on the phrase toxic masculinity, and says and shows how it does more harm than good. It's ideological, not really scientific. It's a phrase that's thoughtlessly used, and it does more harm than good. Certainly, as a therapist, I've worked with a number of boys and men where, in some cases, their previous therapist blamed toxic masculinity for their problems, and that just made them completely disengage. What do you mean? I don't want to hear that. Do I need to hear that? The film Adolescence, whilst people have said it's a great film, it's been treated, and I think our Prime Minister on 2 occasions, I believe, referred to it as a documentary. It is quite literally, it is quite literally not a documentary at all, at all. And whilst it addresses, I think the creators was in, we want it to address knife crime. The narrative that follows, I would argue, hasn't really addressed knife crime at all. It's addressed perceptions around gender. It's because we are going to go into schools now and we are going to teach boys about toxic masculinity, giving girls respect, and so on, and all of this. But again, all it does is it peddles that narrative that suggests boys and men are the problem, girls and women need to be protected. Well, if you are not going into schools and teaching girls and boys the importance of giving respect and engaging in healthy relationships, and you're only doing that in a very rigidly gendered way, how might that influence how girls and women behave and feel? How might that influence how boys and young men behave and feel? And it just seems to be a question that we're not even considering. Some people are. There have been some articles, some blogs. There's been some people saying, actually, the narrative behind adolescence, it's not toxic masculinity it's the narrative about boys, men, and masculinity that is toxic.
Interesting. What do you make of, you kind of got this movement of people who call themselves incels. I've heard MGTOW, men going their own way, people who are, a lot of men just saying like, I don't want to date, I don't want, just kind of dropping out of that segment of society altogether. What do you make of that?
I think so ultimately, I think you might be leaning towards what's called the manosphere. And there's a term I coined the other week called the misandrosphere, which I think we should start using more often, maybe, where, an online sphere where, men are hated, men, abuse against men is mocked, men are neglected, there's a lot of that going on. But again, that's the side of the coin that we ignore. I think there's different groups within it. So, for example, the manosphere, let's define it first. So let's say an online, various spheres under an overall manosphere. Yes, some of them are abusive, misogynistic, hateful, and that, of course, needs tackling. But to suggest, and I've seen this, I've seen a few people talk about this, you've got people online talking about masculinity, right? Yeah, and why is that a problem? Oh, you've got men online talking about how they've had problems in relationships with women and how women abuse them. What's wrong with that? So again, I think we need to be open to the fact that not every single, sub-sphere within the manosphere is bad and abusive. Some of them are, and of course that needs to be dealt with. But not all of them are. And I think there's just, it links into that rigid thinking that anything to do with men, anything masculine orientated is automatically bad or viewed with suspicion. And I often refer to the work, I mentioned John Barry earlier on, I refer to the work of John Barry and Martin Seeger, who are psychologists, how they talk about archetypal masculinity and how, it's healthy expression is good and positive, and how it's helped create the world, and how it protects people, and how it kind of really helps people to do well in life and strive and achieve. But there seems to be this real suspicion that anything masculine that is viewed as positive or healthy is, oh no, that's not right. That's not right. I spoke to a professional within a university about an issue, and when I said that I kind of, work with a lot of boys and men, and it's sometimes around masculinity, the automatic assumption was that, yeah, masculinity is bad. You're helping them deal with their toxic masculinity. I went, no, 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 that's not what I do. What I do is I try and understand their idea about masculinity. Well, how do they define it? What does it mean to them? And actually look at, again, what John Barry and Martin Seeger call archetypal masculinity, and how elements of that can actually help boys and men deal with stress, anxiety, and abuse.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There's this big double standard in popular culture and in the media. Anything you talk about where men are gathered to talk about masculinity or how they've been wronged by women, the just kind of knee-jerk reaction is this is misogyny. But I've documented quite a few mainstream feminists who regularly use phrases like all men are trash or kill all men. And this is kind of, and mainstream figures like Ezra Klein have dismissed this. Oh, this is just a phrase of social justice. Kill all men is just social justice. Like there's a massive double standard there.
Massive. And again, there are, I'm all for different types of humor and things like that, but you've got to think of the context and the sphere you're in, know your audience. But the bottom line is, and all it is, it's just justifying misandry. Misandry, the hatred, contempt, dislike, prejudice, bias against boys and men because they're boys and men. All it does, all it is, it's justifying or attempting to justify misandry. That's all it is. It takes the demographic of boys and men, treats them as a collective and goes, you're bad. And it's, yes, because the people who oppressed me, the people who've abused me, they were men. And so that means it's okay for me to treat the entire demographic, generally of men, like that. It's prejudice. Do it with any other demographic and see what happens. It's absolute prejudice. That's what it is. And ultimately, what it shows is a hateful attitude. And so people say this, like, oh, it's just a phrase. We don't mean all. And I'm like, don't say all then. If you don't mean, it's really not that difficult. When I phone the takeaway and I want a pizza, I don't phone and order all the pizzas. So then when they knock on my door and bring me all the pizzas, I don't go, I didn't mean all. Yes, but you said all. It's really not that difficult. If you don't mean all, don't say all. It's like, is it more important for you to come up with a catchy, simple 3-worded term than convey accuracy in your message? And the problem that we have is, as I've said, going online, saying kill all men, what it clearly evidences is a hateful attitude about the demographic of boys and men. So then the question we need to be asking is, how might that hateful attitude influence certain abusive, harmful behaviour towards boys and men? And that is an important question I think we need to ask that hardly anybody's asking, because come back to what I said, we don't care. Society just does not care at all. If men have a hateful attitude towards women, there's loads of focus on how that attitude has and may influence harm towards girls and women. But there's absolutely, in comparison, zero thought on how people out there who, and when I say people, I mean women and other men, who hate the demographic of boys and men, how that hate might influence harm towards them. Was it November or December last year? I think she was a 15-year-old schoolgirl, Natalie Rupnow in Wisconsin. She went to the school. She, I think, killed 2 teachers who were both women, and I think 4 other people she shot, or 4 other people were injured. Now, it's alleged, I'm picking my words carefully here, it's alleged that before the shooting, she posted something online where she said, all men are, words to the effect of scum of the earth, they all need wiping and eradicating from the world, and all of this sort of stuff. Shortly after that, she went to school and shot people. 2 of them she killed and 4 of them were injured. To the best of my knowledge, and as I sit here now, the 4 people that were injured, the press have not released whether they were male or female. And even though some people have been suspicious around the online post that she made, is it genuine or is it not? This was December. We're now approaching May. Why has it not been confirmed whether it was real or fake? And could it be because that the mainstream media want to do everything they can to make sure that we don't attach clear misandry to actual harm? And that's the thing. When we're showing any sort of adversity, from harsh words criticism, horrible abuse to girls and women, there is this automatic assumption that it is motivated by misogyny. And you know what? Sometimes it might be. But there is absolutely, in comparison, very little thought going into, well, when other people, men and women, harm men, is that motivated by misandry? Well, we're not even going to look into that and we don't care. Why not? Double standard.
How do you think the psychotherapy profession is dealing with issues men and boys face?
Interesting. In my opinion, I personally think the world of psychology is streets ahead compared to the world of counseling and psychotherapy. For example, here we've got the Centre for Male Psychology. There isn't an equivalent within the world of counselling, certainly to the best of my knowledge. There are, I suppose, efforts from the world of counselling to try and help boys and men. In my opinion, I think they often come from a place that is perhaps sometimes a bit patronising to boys and men and implies that they just need to talk and open up and express their emotions. There isn't a lot of acknowledgement of the average differences between what males and females want from therapy. There doesn't seem to be a lot of acknowledgement about that. Within the world of psychology, there is more of that. The British Psychological Society, for example, has their briefing paper, I think it's called, that gives guidance on working with men in therapy. And it kind of really makes good use of good science. It refers to some really credible research and literature around what men on average will want from therapy, whereas the world of counselling doesn't really have anything like that. I get a sense that they're a bit reluctant to do so. So in my experience, they are, I think the world of psychology streets ahead. But I've certainly found that by adopting the principles from various psychological literature, I've seen a massive increase in men coming to me for therapy. Huge. If we go back to 2019, I think it was. Don't quote me, I might get the year wrong. My website, for example, was, years ago, very, very, stereotypically, come to therapy, talk about your emotions, express your feelings, all of that sort of stuff. And there's nothing wrong with that approach at all. It works for plenty of people and that's fine. The problem is when we assume it should work for everybody. I read loads of literature, and actually the literature I read was kind of really supporting what I was slowly starting to do and how I was thinking. So I changed my website to come to therapy, tackle your problems, take control of your life. That's very different wording, words that link to what we might call archetypal masculinity. I saw a massive increase in boys and men coming to me for therapy. And I'm like, wow, this clearly works. And then in the therapy, using different language. So rather than saying things like, it's okay to, so for example, if someone says, oh, coming to therapy makes me feel makes me feel really weak and I'm vulnerable, some might say that a traditional response perhaps could be, it's okay to feel weak, it's okay to be vulnerable, whereas another response that might lean a little bit more towards archetypal masculinity could say, guess that's one way of looking at it, and I guess another way could be that you're here, it feels uncomfortable to be here. And even though it's uncomfortable, you're still here. You've still made that call. You're still going through this. And so even though you're doing something that feels uncomfortable, I guess that might take more strength. And maybe this is the start of you this early days of starting to take control and fix things. So it's very different language. But ultimately what you do is you kind of use elements of masculinity to reframe the boy or man's perception. And I find in many ways that absolutely works, and it can help engage them. It can help to see things differently, different things for different people.
Very interesting. We talked about how like violent or abusive men are like, that's an unhealthy conception of masculinity, and how, painting all men as toxic is also an unhealthy way to view masculinity. Could you, you got into it a little bit just now, but paint me more of a picture of what healthy masculinity looks like.
Well, everyone's got different views on this. So even people and colleagues who where we share similar views, even some of us disagree on this. So I think, so again, I keep mentioning John Barry and Martin Seeger because I'm influenced by a lot of their work. And so Martin, if he's listening to this, will probably know what I'm about to say. I think masculine is like a hammer. A hammer is just a hammer. You can take it and bash someone on the head with it and kill them. You can take it and contribute towards building a house with it and giving someone a home. So is the hammer good or bad? Is it toxic or tonic? I would say neither. The hammer's just the hammer. How you use it is a different story. And what influences how you use it, display it, express it is influenced by your history, your upbringing, usually any previous trauma that you may have had. And so if we go down the route of healthy and unhealthy, it could be an element of what we might call archetypal masculinities, control. Control, not that I'm saying control is something women can't do and shouldn't do at all. I think what we have to accept is there are masculine traits and feminine traits, and that men are a mixture of both and women are a mixture of both, and sometimes we display some more than the other, and let's appreciate the context. But for now, if we just take the issue of control, well, if a man is controlling his wife, controlling where she goes, what she does, who she speaks to, what she wears, what she eats, what she watches on TV, then I think we can all reasonably say that that is an unhealthy impact of control being used. But if we are, what about considering other ways that control can be displayed in a way that causes a healthy impact? You control your emotions within a certain remit, within certain spaces. You control your finances. You control your anger. You control your behavior. You control the direction you want your life to go in to achieve things. These are all brilliant types of control. And I'm not saying that women don't do that, because I can imagine people saying, oh, so men do it and women? No, but I would argue that the element of control is perhaps more of a masculine trait than a feminine trait. That doesn't mean it's a bad thing. Some people might disagree with me, and that's okay. But as I've said, men have masculine and feminine traits. Women have masculine and feminine traits. We're all, a bit of a mishmash of both.
I like that. I have one final question for you, and that is, when you look at society more broadly, what is one issue that we're not talking about enough that we should be talking about more?
I think I've kind of maybe touched upon it, I have touched on it already. The hatred and neglect of men. Simple as that. Maybe there are specific issues, as I've touched upon, under that heading that need addressing more. But yeah, it's the hatred and neglect of men. That, the issue of misandry. There are people I speak to that know what misogyny is. They talk about it a lot. Some of them assume what misogyny is. Some of them, I've had people that say to me, misogyny is when a man is horrible to a woman. Well, it's a bit more than that, isn't it? But yeah, the issue of later this year, if I get time, I've got a lot on at the minute, but later this year, I will probably start writing my second book. And it's going to be focusing on the hatred and neglect of men. And I have a huge amount of information to put in this book. I'm going to have to kind of whittle it down, but we don't talk about that enough. And what we do is we kind of, we hold a magnifying glass up to known or suspected misogyny. But when it comes to known or suspected misandry, that magnifying glass turns into a blind eye.
That's a really good point that you made. I feel like I've known the word misogyny since I was very young, but I didn't hear the word misandry until a couple of years ago.
Yep, there we go. And that says everything, doesn't it? And ultimately you have, and it gets very boring, and everyone repeats this, and it's completely false. Misandry doesn't exist. And if you engage in and I do my best to engage in a debate can get heated, but I always try and be respectful in these debates, which opponents often don't. They get into I've been called an incel, I've been called all sorts of things, it gets a bit boring. I like it when people insult me in a very creative way. Someone insulted me last year saying his forehead is so big you could land a helicopter on it. I like that one. That made me laugh. I like an insult that's going to make me giggle. But when you're an incel, yeah, it's a bit boring, But absolutely. Lots of people know what misogyny is, but not misandry. So is misandry real? Of course it is. Of course it is. And people get it wrong. What people make two mistakes. The definition of misandry that they use is the incorrect one. Well, misandry it's not institutional, it's not systemic. Well, I would argue that yes, it is. But even if I agreed that, it's not systemic, which I don't, well, that's not the definition of misandry. The definition of misandry is hatred, contempt, prejudice for boys and men. Whether it is or isn't systemic is a different issue altogether. So people are using, and what they're saying is, well, this is how misogyny exists. So misandry exists differently, so therefore it doesn't exist. No, misandry existing possibly differently to misogyny is not proof it doesn't exist. And then you've also got people that will continue to use the definition. They forget that it's defined as an attitude, and they'll say it isn't real, it doesn't exist. But again, as I say, if you continue to engage in debate with these people, you end up in most cases, in my experience, hearing that they say misandry does exist, and they are glad it exists, and they want it to exist. Go to Twitter, for example. Type in the word proud misogynist. You will get, numerous profiles. Type in the word proud misandrist. You will get more. And I think the problem is, whilst genuine misogyny and the attitude of misogyny, of course, without a doubt, needs tackling, it needs addressing. I'm certainly not saying it shouldn't, but it doesn't mean we should completely ignore misandry because some of us believe it's not as bad. And how do we know it's not as bad when, we go digging and looking for misogyny, but we never even pick up the shovel to go digging for misandry? One example I'll just very quickly share. One example is last year there was an article in the Guardian, well, it was all over in the newspapers, saying something like 2 million men they pose a risk to women. 2 million men, I can't remember the exact wording, but 2 million men, I think in England and Wales, pose a risk of violence towards women. Right, well, where have you got that from? Now, a lot of people just believe that automatically, and I think that's because some people, arguably many people, are very quick to believe the worst in men. I did a bit of a deep dive. I put my freedom of information request. I looked into and actually, if we look at it, that 2 million figure is derived, shall we say, from data that says 2 million women reported sexual harassment. So what does that mean? Well, when you look into it, sexual harassment can range, and this is from the Office of National Statistics, so it's there. Sexual harassment can range from an inappropriate joke to wolf whistling, catcalling, and something more blatantly inappropriate. Not that I'm saying the former is not inappropriate. Of course it is, but they're on different levels of severity. Then
there's a difference between whistling at someone and assaulting them.
Absolutely, yes. There is a massive difference between, whistling at someone, I would say, compared to a brutal, violent sex. Of course there is. People might disagree with me, that's my opinion. However, when you look into the data even more, the vast majority of those 2 million women that reported sexual harassment, the most sexual harassment they reported related to inappropriate jokes. So the question then we have is, hang on a minute, can we really say that possibly 2 million men pose a threat of violence to women when that's based on data that says it links to sexual harassment, and the most reported sexual harassment under the category is inappropriate jokes? Aren't we making a massive leap from an inappropriate joke to physical violence? I think we are. And I think we don't help we're demonizing men and we're keeping women scared. How's that helping anyone? And whilst I think sexual harassment, of course, should be dealt with, of course, violence should be dealt with, of course, all manner of sexual harassment should be dealt with, and at the same time, we cannot reasonably or logically say that because 2 million women have reported various types of sexual harassment, with the majority of that being inappropriate jokes, we can't say that equates to 2 million men pose a risk of violence to women. That's just not reasonable. But again, we're not having these conversations. And if we start to have these conversations, you are very quickly called an incel, a misogynist, all these thoughtless comments, which you say, no, let's just have a discussion about this without any insults, without any accusations flying around. Yes, of course, violence against women, against anyone, should be dealt with. Of course it should. But we're not going to help anyone with this sort of context-free distortion of language and exaggeration.
That's such a good point. And kind of back to a previous point that you made, I think a lot of them, if you press them, they would say, well, you know what, this kind of is a bias against men, but it's necessary to kind of right the historic wrongs. So, at some point, women were not allowed to vote. Therefore, some degree of misandry is appropriate and necessary to kind of balance the historic scales.
It's really, we teach children this when they're little. Two rights don't make a wrong. Do we really have to teach adults this? No, not at all. And ultimately, yes, I would also argue that historically, there were many ways that boys and men were disadvantaged, faced adversity as well. We don't talk about that enough, but I think that, yes, historically, there are examples of women experiencing various types of adversity, stopped from doing certain things. I'm not saying that doesn't exist, but what those women went through historically does not justify treating men today in the way that we do because of what other men did years ago. That's just a very poor excuse for, hateful, prejudiced behavior.
Yes. Where can people find you?
If people do want to find me, I suppose the two main places, one, my website, so counsellingwithphil.co.uk, or Twitter, or X, as we're calling it now, and my handle is Phil Mitchell.
Well, I love this conversation. This is fascinating, and I'd love to talk to you again anytime.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been very interesting. Thank you very much.